"You don't look like someone who belongs here." The words were soft enough to be mistaken for courtesy, but they weren't. They sliced through the hum of the cabin like broken glass on tile. Conversations stuttered to a halt. Laughter faded. Even the shuffle of boarding slowed as passengers turned their heads toward the front row. Maya Johnson, 27, paused mid-scroll on her phone. Her shoulders straightened, her face unreadable. Beside her, Imani, 23, tugged out one earbud, confusion flashing across her eyes. Hovering above them stood the flight attendant, badge polished, arms folded tight across her chest. Carol Whitmore. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her tone carried the kind of authority people were conditioned not to question. "These are our seats," Maya said, calm but edged in steel. Carol's lips pressed thin. "I'll need to see your boarding passes again." The air thickened. Nearby passengers leaned in, eager witnesses to a ritual too familiar. Proof demanded not because of error, but because of skin. What unfolded in that instant wasn't about aviation or ticketing. It was about the invisible weight carried into every room, every line, every seat where belonging could still be questioned. But before that weight turned into confrontation, before hashtags and headlines, there had been a morning like any other. JFK International. Sky the color of dull steel. A black SUV pulling up to Terminal 4 at 7:42 sharp. Maya stepped out first, sharp trench coat, pressed slacks, elegance honed by years of knowing she would always be judged before she spoke. Imani followed in her sneakers and navy jumpsuit, earbuds already blasting music, carrying a different kind of armor. They weren't there to make a scene. They weren't there to prove anything. They were simply flying. First class, fully paid, earned without apology. But on this flight, existence alone would prove provocative enough. Maya's fingers tightened around her phone, but her face didn't change. Years of practice had taught her the art of silence as resistance. "These are our seats," she repeated, slower this time. "We purchased them weeks ago." Carol's smile was paper-thin. "First class isn't usually this casual. Perhaps you're mistaken." The words dripped with condescension. The implication was louder than her voice. "You don't fit the picture." Imani pulled her mask down from her face, tugging the other earbud free. "Mistaken?" she asked, her voice sharper, younger, unwilling to bend. "We're in 1A and 1B. Exactly where our tickets say." The tension snapped into visibility. Conversations stilled. Screens tilted up as phones quietly began recording. A man 2 rows back, gray hair, gold watch, leaned into the aisle. Richard Hale. Retired banker. He smirked. "I told you," he whispered to his wife, loud enough for others to hear. "Someone took our seats." His wife shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Maya turned her head, her eyes narrowing. "Your seats? These were ours when we boarded. They're still ours now." A murmur spread through the cabin like a low tide. Familiar words, uncomfortably familiar scene. Everyone watching, few willing to speak. Until one woman rose. Row 4. Elena Morales, 60 years old, retired schoolteacher, Latina. She placed her hand firmly on the headrest in front of her, and spoke with the calm clarity of someone who had taught children for 4 decades. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying enough weight to silence the whispering. "Why are you questioning only these 2 young women?" Carol's jaw tightened. "There seems to be a seating discrepancy." "Then check the manifest," Elena replied, folding her arms. "That doesn't require moving anyone." A ripple of agreement passed through the rows. Nods. Eyes shifting. A few passengers muttered. She's right. From the galley, a younger flight attendant, Derek Williams, stepped forward, hesitation in his movements. He was black, early 30s, and his silence up until now had felt like complicity. But something in Elena's voice had cracked it open. "Ma'am," he said carefully, reaching for the company-issued tablet. "Allow me." Carol hesitated, then passed it over. Derek scrolled, eyes sharp. After a beat, he looked up. Row 1A, Maya Johnson. Row 1B, Imani Johnson. Booked 3 weeks ago. Paid in full. The words landed heavy, undeniable. Imani smirked faintly, glancing at Maya. "You hear that?" she said, her voice low but carrying. Maya's gaze remained steady, fixed on Carol. "If it had been anyone else," she said quietly, "would you have asked twice?" Carol's mouth opened, closed. No words came. And in that silence, the truth was louder than anything she could have said. The silence was suffocating. Passengers stared, caught between discomfort and curiosity, waiting for someone else to speak. It was Imani who moved first. With a flick of her thumb, she opened her phone camera, not to record privately, but to stream. The small red icon pulsed in the corner of her screen. Live. Maya noticed, but she didn't stop her. She only straightened in her seat, posture commanding, voice carrying with quiet fire. "We're not asking for special treatment," she said, her tone measured but resonant enough for the first 5 rows to hear. "We're asking for the same respect anyone else would receive in these seats." Imani angled her phone slightly, capturing not only herself and Maya but the cabin around them, faces of strangers now immortalized in digital history. A ripple of awareness moved through the passengers as they realized the world was already watching. Carol shifted uncomfortably, her authority cracking under the weight of too many eyes. She forced a brittle smile. "Ladies, no one is questioning your value." Maya cut her off, calm but relentless. "You questioned our presence. And that's not the same thing." A collective inhale swept the cabin. A truth spoken so plainly, it couldn't be softened. Richard Hale scoffed, voice rising from row 3. "This is unnecessary. Those seats were supposed to be ours. Anyone can see that." Maya turned to him, unflinching. "Anyone can see what, exactly?" Richard faltered, his cheeks reddening, his certainty suddenly exposed as prejudice dressed in entitlement. From behind, Elena's voice cut through again. "Enough. They've shown their tickets. They belong here." A few passengers began clapping, hesitant at first, then firmer. The sound wasn't thunderous, but it was enough. Enough to tip the scales. Derek, still holding the manifest, read the line once more for the entire cabin to hear. "Seats 1A and 1B, Maya Johnson. Imani Johnson. No errors. No discrepancies. They are in the right place." The applause grew louder. Some passengers filmed, others simply nodded. But the shift was undeniable. What began as suspicion had become solidarity. Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, deliberate. "You wanted to check who we are. But this isn't about our names. It's about what you expected to see in this row. And when we didn't match your picture, suddenly, our presence became a problem." Her words hung heavy, a mirror held up to the entire cabin. And with Imani's live stream, that mirror now faced the world. The plane leveled into silence, but the silence was no longer the same. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was recognition. A current of awareness, uncomfortable but undeniable, humming through every row. Imani's phone kept streaming, comments flying across the screen. "Unbelievable. Stay strong. This is why we film everything." The world had entered the cabin at 30,000 feet. Carol retreated toward the galley, her polished authority crumbling with each step. She had worn her uniform like armor for decades, certain of her judgment, certain of the order she believed she was preserving. But now, every movement felt heavy with exposure. She wasn't a guardian of order anymore, she was the face of its failure. Richard Hale sat stiff in 3C, jaw clenched, hands folded too tightly in his lap. He told himself he wasn't the villain here, that he had only asked a question. But deep down he knew, his silence had been agreement, his nod had been permission. And then, from row 4, Elena spoke again, gentle this time, almost tender. "You don't have to double down," she said, voice carrying enough to reach Carol, enough to sting Richard. "You can choose to do better now." The words pierced more than accusation ever could. They offered no escape, but they offered a path. By the time the flight touched down in Dallas, Imani's livestream had surpassed 2 million views. Hashtags trended, hashtag flying while black, hashtag first row, hashtag respect on board. News outlets picked up the footage before the wheels even touched the runway. At baggage claim, strangers approached the sisters quietly. A woman whispered, "Thank you for not moving." A father pressed a hand over his son's shoulder and nodded in silent gratitude. The story spread across the country. Morning shows, headlines, editorials, college classrooms and corporate boardrooms. And then came the unexpected turn. Carol Whitmore, the flight attendant whose voice had started it all, disappeared from the skies for weeks. Suspended, shamed, her name splashed across articles she never imagined being part of. But instead of retreating into bitterness, she signed up, first reluctantly, then with urgency, for racial equity workshops. She began volunteering at a community center in Queens, helping young women, many who looked like Maya and Imani, prepare for job interviews and face the quiet battles she had once ignored. "I thought I was keeping order," she admitted in one session. "But the order I defended was never fair to begin with." Richard Hale's reckoning came slower. At home, his wife Judith looked him in the eye and said, "Legacy isn't what you did in a bank, Richard. Legacy is what you do when no one's clapping." For weeks, he avoided the news, avoided mirrors. But eventually, guilt wore him down to honesty. He reached out to colleagues he had once overlooked, men and women of color who had worked beside him, their voices muted under the weight of his presence. For the first time, he listened. 3 months later, Richard donated a portion of his retirement fund to launch a scholarship. He called it the First Row Initiative, not to erase what had happened, but to carry its weight forward into something redemptive. And Maya and Imani? They didn't ask to be symbols. They didn't set out to ignite a movement. They had only insisted on their seats, on their dignity. But sometimes, refusing to move is enough to move the world. By the time the sisters walked out of Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, the story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to every person who had ever been asked to prove their place. The video had been replayed millions of times. Teenagers mimicked Maya's calm voice in classrooms. Community leaders quoted Imani's livestream as a call to vigilance. Even a veteran, gray-haired and unsteady, recorded himself saying, "I fought so every American could sit anywhere on that plane. And I'm proud those young women stayed seated." But for Maya and Imani, the headlines were background noise. What mattered was quieter. A text from their father, "You didn't just earn your seats. You honored them." A hug from their mother, who whispered, "I knew you would hold the line." The cabin of Flight 227 had become a mirror. Some saw their prejudice laid bare. Others saw their courage reflected. And for those willing to look, it was impossible to look away unchanged. Carol Whitmore, once the unyielding gatekeeper, now stood in community halls, telling her story not as an excuse but as a warning. She had learned that protocol without justice was just prejudice in uniform. Richard Hale, the man who once muttered from row 3, now signed scholarship letters with a trembling hand, sending first-generation students of color to college. He knew the debt could never be repaid, but it could be acknowledged. And the Johnson sisters? They kept flying. They kept walking into rooms with the same composure their father had taught them, carrying the knowledge that dignity was never something to be granted. It was theirs all along. The lesson of Flight 227 was simple, yet heavy enough to change a nation. Prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in questions like, "Are you sure you belong here?" Sometimes it hides behind, "Just doing my job." And sometimes it is the silence of those who look away. But courage doesn't always roar either. Sometimes it is a calm voice saying no. Sometimes it is a phone camera held steady. Sometimes it is simply remaining seated when the world demands you stand. Dignity does not require permission. And so, the invitation extends to everyone watching, listening, remembering. What is your first row? Where have you been asked to prove your right to exist? Will you stay silent, or will you speak? Will you move, or will you remain? Because the world doesn't change only through headlines. It changes through choices, small, daily, deliberate. And when we choose to stay seated in the face of injustice, we aren't just holding a place. We are holding the line for everyone who comes after us. The story of Flight 227 didn't end when the wheels touched down. It lived on, across television screens, classrooms, offices, pulpits, and kitchen tables. For some, it was outrage. For others, it was a wake-up call. And for many, it was a mirror. Students recreated Maya's words in school assemblies. Activists turned Imani's live stream into a rallying cry. On social media, strangers shared their own first-row stories. Moments when they were told, silently or directly, that they didn't belong. Maya watched the videos late at night, her face lit by the glow of her phone. She wasn't looking for fame. She wasn't looking for validation. She was searching for one thing, proof that it had mattered. And everywhere she looked, it had. Imani carried the live stream like a badge of fire. She was the younger sister, but she had been the first to press record, the first to say, "The world needs to see this." Her inbox filled with messages from other young women, some angry, some grateful, all hungry for change. And in that wave of voices, something shifted. The story wasn't about two women anymore. It was about all of them. The cabin of Flight 227 had become more than a stage. It had become a mirror the nation couldn't avoid. Months later, the world had moved on to new stories, new scandals, new headlines. But for those who lived Flight 227, time had not erased it. It had reshaped them. Maya Johnson had returned to her law firm in Manhattan, but she was no longer the same quiet associate who once blended into rooms. Now, when she stood to speak, she carried the weight of millions who had watched her stay seated. Law schools invited her to lecture. Young women sought her advice. And though she never asked for it, she had become a symbol of composure turned into defiance. Imani, meanwhile, turned her live stream into a platform. She began writing articles, producing podcasts, mentoring student journalists who wanted to expose the subtle violences that never made headlines. "We don't just tell stories," she reminded them. "We tell the truths people try to look away from." Their lives didn't become easier. If anything, the spotlight brought new pressures, new critics. But it also gave them a chorus of allies, strangers across the country who now whispered the same phrase, "Stay seated. Hold your row." For Carol Whitmore, the wait was different. In the subway, she noticed the looks. At the grocery store, she overheard whispers. That's the flight attendant. Her uniform no longer gave her authority. It made her a symbol of bias exposed. She could have hidden. She could have grown bitter. Instead, she leaned into discomfort. Week after week, she attended workshops on racial equity. In the evenings, she volunteered at a community center. One night, sitting with a group of young women preparing for job interviews, she confessed aloud what she had avoided even to herself. I thought I was protecting safety. But really, I was protecting an order that was never fair. And when fairness threatens your comfort, it isn't fairness at all. The room was quiet, then one young woman reached out and squeezed her hand. For the first time in months, Carol felt the faint possibility of redemption. Richard Hale's journey was slower, heavier. Pride resisted change. But guilt gnawed at him. His wife's words haunted him. Legacy is what you do when no one claps. He began meeting with students from communities he once ignored. At first, he sat stiffly, a man out of place. But then a freshman named Jamal looked him in the eye and said, "Because of your scholarship, I sat in the front row of my first college class today. And I didn't feel like I had to move." Richard swallowed hard. He had given money, but Jamal had given him something back, an unflinching reflection of who he had been and who he might still become. And so the First Row initiative grew. Not just a scholarship but a movement. Churches preached about it. Companies rewrote policies. Classrooms discussed it. Families told their children, "Remember Maya and Imani. Remember the first row." The legacy of Flight 227 was not just about a plane. It was about a question. Who decides where we belong? The answer came not from policies, not from protocols, but from two young women who refused to move. Because dignity is not a seat upgrade. It is not granted by authority. It is not revoked by suspicion. Dignity is earned by being. It is defended by staying. And it multiplies every time someone else finds the courage to hold their place. The flight was long over. But its turbulence had become history. And the invitation remains, to everyone who hears the story. Where is your first row? Will you shrink into silence, or will you claim your place? Because the world does not only change in protests or speeches. It changes in quiet refusals, in steady voices, in the strength to remain seated when the world demands you rise. Sometimes history is not written by those who move. Sometimes it is written by those who stay.